Hi, my name is Lauren Hudak and I'm a senior at Seaholm High School. The name of my big board is The Real Price of the United States Intervention in the Middle East. I'm going to start with some facts and some figures, and they might get a little bit long and I might kind of drone on, but bear with me because they're important to the moral of my paper. 654,965 Iraqis have lost their lives as a result of the Iraq War. 21,000 civilians are estimated to have died as a result of the war in Afghanistan. 20,000 to 50,000 civilians have been slaughtered in Pakistan. In terms of U.S. casualties, over 6,000 American soldiers have lost their lives in the Middle East, and 1 million have been wounded, in addition to the 2,753 American civilians killed in a terrorist attack that occurred on September 11, 2001. Now, of course, all of this isn't counting the multitude of American civilian casualties that have occurred as a result of Islamic terrorist attacks, such as the U.S. Embassy bombing of 1993 and 1998, the Boston Marathon bombings of 2013, and the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. All of this leads me to one single point, my thesis. The widespread conflicts that exist between the U.S. and some parts of the Middle East have transitioned from being rooted into political necessity to being fueled by ideological differences and social distrust as a result of past political action. Now, to kind of explain this a little bit, I'd like to backtrack. So after talking about the conflict between U.S. and the Middle East, it is easy to say that, as with most wars after, social tensions between the two regions are not at an all-time high. This has been true with all wars. The tensions between Germans and Americans and most Allied forces during World War II is still visible, according to many people that live in Germany today. Now, this can be found with many wars. However, this conflict between the Middle East and America is unique in that not only are there social distrust and tensions as a result of the conflict between the two regions, but the social tensions and distrust have actually served to fuel the war and actually transformed the political policy of both regions. So, to restate my thesis, the widespread conflicts that exist between the U.S. and some parts of the Middle East have transitioned from being rooted in political necessity before the war to being fueled by ideological differences and social distrust as a result of past political action, so as a result of the conflict. So, to kind of prove this, I'd like to go through a history of the Middle Eastern U.S. conflict, and this is a very, very brief history because we are confined to 20 minutes. So I'm just going to talk about some of the key events in my mind that kind of stick out when talking about the conflict. So first I'm going to talk about sort of pre-war action, pre-conflict action, and that really began mostly in the latter half of the 20th century. That was when America really started to have political influence on the politics of the Middle East and vice versa. And I kind of like to point out one of the first major political moves of the U.S. in the Middle East was when the UN recognized the State of Israel officially in 1947. And this had a huge impact on foreign policy of the Middle East and the U.S. Because if you are familiar with the Israel-Palestine conflict, you'll understand why. But I'm going to give a quick, brief recap. So it's been a conflict that's been going on for hundreds of years, and most Arab countries in the Arab League, refuse to recognize Israel as an official state. They think it's a legally occupied territory that belongs to the Arab League, that belongs to Palestine. However, Israel, backed with many of its allied forces, U.S. being the main one, refuses to leave and holds their presence there. And there have been many peace treaties offered to Palestine from Israel, but they've rejected all of them. They continue to occupy small designated places of Israel, like the Gaza Strip and the Gaza Strip. And so this is a huge conflict. There's war going on right now. There has been for the last few decades. And the U.S. Pretty much pays for Israel's side of the war. We're their biggest ally, and they're one of our biggest allies, especially in the Middle East. And so many Arab countries they don't agree with this. So was one of the first major grievances that the U.S. inflicted upon the Arab world, is recognizing the State of Israel as a state, because before then it had not been officially recognized. And then kind of during Eisenhower's reign, I'm going to talk about two events that happened, and that'll sum up my pre-conflict sum of the U.S. political interference in the Middle East. So the first issue I want to talk about with President Eisenhower was the Iranian coup d'etat of 1953. And this happened when the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, rallied to nationalize Iran's oil production And prior to that, the oil production had been controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was a British-owned company, and they took all but 10% of the profit from Iran oil production, and the rest of it went to Iran, but it was a very, very small amount. And so the president kind of deemed it necessary to nationalize the oil production. So Britain called upon America to help and to stage a coup and throw a coup and kind of install our own government, install a leader of our choice into the government. And America did, because America ended up siding with Britain and helping them to keep the oil production flowing to them. And there are many reasons why America did this, but in general, or mostly, it was a strategic political action. According to Eisenhower's administration, he was weary of nationalism in the Third World, sympathetic to oil interests, and concerned with what it perceived as the spread of communism. And so this marked a huge step in the foreign policy between the U.S. and the Middle East, because it showed that the U.S. was willing to disrupt the political order of a foreign country in order to further its own agenda. And so this would be strategic political action. And it happened again with the Suez Crisis of 1956, which was when the Egyptian president Nasser, he was looking to nationalize as well the Suez Canal Company. And at the time, it was duly owned by Britain and France. And it was a huge economic trade route, and it would have made a huge difference in the economy. And so the U.S., when they were kind of watching this conflict go down, they knew that Russia would intervene on Egypt's behalf, and sort of they would kind of fight for them. So the President Eisenhower was hoping to prevent the Soviet Union from coming to Egypt's aid, because he didn't want any more communist interference in the Middle East, because he knew it was such a large region, apparently. So he didn't want communism to become widespread there. So he suppressed Britain and France, and he introduced what is now called the Eisenhower Doctrine. And the Eisenhower Doctrine is a very, very, very important move in political strategy in the Middle East in the second half of the 20th century. And it states, according to the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Historian, under the Eisenhower Doctrine, a country could request American economic assistance and or aid from the U.S. military forces if it was being threatened by armed aggression from another state. And this doctrine set yet another precedent for U.S. foreign policy. And to put the sentiment in Zach Beauchamp's words, a famed historian, it was now officially America's job to police the Middle East. So these three events that I stated, they all kind of prove that pre-conflict between the U.S. and the Middle East, the U.S. Mostly only intervened in the Middle East to settle, or to kind of do strategic political action, or with strategic political action, to settle formal disputes between governments, to instill its own political agenda, and most of the interference was very nonviolent. And however, after a long period of large-scale U.S. intervention, staging coups, overthrowing dictators, just pretty much policing the Middle East to an extent that they were not comfortable with, certain extremist elements in the Arab world began to organize against American interests globally. Deep distrust, illustrated by, I have a visual that illustrates the deep distrust between the U.S. and the Arab world, and this is a poll taken from Arabs and how it kind of measures their feelings towards Americans. I don't have it with me, but it shows that the U.S. in the Middle East, in the main players of the Middle East, so Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel was actually included as part of that, which is interesting. So in every country but Israel that was a main player in the Middle East, the favorabilities were at an all-time low for America, whereas in other European countries they were pretty average, and other African countries they were kind of, half and half. However, in America they were all under 50%. They were all very low, except for Israel, which, as America's greatest ally, gave it a favorability rating of 84%, which is one of its highest favorability ratings for any country. So this was a big deal because it shows, and these numbers are all taken in between 2000 and 2014. They remain fairly steady, but 2014 was the year I used to compare. And so these all prove that the main players of the Arab world did not trust America pre-intervention, pre-U.S. invasion. There were very real social tensions between the two. And after doing a lot of research, it is fairly succinct to say that the two main cited reasons for Arabs' distrust of the American world the American nation, is the Iraq War and the Israel-Palestine conflict. And there are many other social tensions that are explained at detail in my essay, because between any two countries, I mean, there has to be some social tensions between the two of us. And so there are many between Iraq. Mostly, they think that we have too much unprecedented amount of control in the world. They do not think we should be a superpower. Other propaganda type surface tensions, but just to cite the main two political ones would be the Iraq War and the Israel-Palestine conflict. And in terms of the Iraq War, there is a poll to indicate that indicated what the average Iraqi citizen's feelings towards the Iraq War was. And the majority of Iraqi respondents say that the impact of the war has been negative with respect to their personal safety and security. This was 72%. 66% said it was negative in respect to their economic development and employment. Administration of government services, 59%, and relations with neighboring countries, 54%. And one half feel that there has been a negative impact on political freedom, which was not supposed to be the goal of the war. And almost one half of Iraqis feel the impact on education has been negative. So thus, I mean, the Iraq War was not, in general, not viewed as it was viewed as detrimental to the country of Iraq by the citizens that lived there. So that's one of the major reasons for the social distrust that they have for the U.S. and for the subsequent uprisings and terrorist attacks. And so also another reason that I did mention earlier in this presentation was the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that's a very, very important one. The Iraq War was devastating to many people. Lots of lives were lost. The Israel-Palestine conflict is more confined between the two territories. However, it does have a huge impact on the U.S. The U.S. is the main backer for Israel for this war, and many people believe that if the U.S. did not recognize the state of Israel and did not back them in this war, then there wouldn't be as much of a problem. Israel would not be as powerful as it is, and it really enrages many Arab nationalists. And thus, members of the Arab world have made it clear any country that publicly supports and funds Israel in its fight to stay alive has declared itself anti-Islamic. And that's a big word, anti-Islamitism. Many people think that the U.S. has what they call Islamophobia. And so that many people in the Arab world think that we distrust them. And many polls show that they distrust us. And many polls also show that we do distrust them. It's not just a feeling that they have. So the social distrust between the two countries is rampant. Or between the two nations, I'm sorry. Between the two regions, I'm sorry, is rampant. So all of this led to what I'm going to talk about now, which is terrorism, Islamic terrorism against Americans. And there have been many incidents. I'm going to bring up 4 or 5 key ones that really defined the Middle Eastern strategy against the U.S. In April of 1983, the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. This was carried out by Islamic Jihadist Organization, which was a fundamentalist Shia group. The World Trade Center bombing of February 26, 1993. The Kenya and Nairobi dual simultaneous U.S. Embassy bombings, which occurred in 1997. And the 2000 attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. So for these all happened pre-9/11, and many Islamic fundamentalist groups are to blame for these attacks. However, leading up to the turn of the century, because these all happened prior to and in 2000, many of the events that happened could be traced back to Al-Qaeda, which was led by Osama bin Laden. It was a terrorist group, and Al-Qaeda was pretty much hell-bent on destroying American interests. So with each of these attacks, Al-Qaeda became more influential in the Middle East and was able to gather enough resources to commit what was inarguably the most heinous terrorist act to occur on American soil, the bombing on September 11, 2001. So much of my presentation so far has kind of, it's kind of been pre-9/11 and after the turn of the century, after 2000. So what my thesis kind of points to is that pre-9/11, most of the political interference between these two countries was especially most of the U.S. intervention started as out of political necessity. The wars were mostly nonviolent. There was violence, but it wasn't how the wars were characterized, and they were for political reasons. However, 9/11 marked a huge turning point. The U.S. intervention had caused many tensions in the Middle East, which led to terrorist acts being occurred, and therefore led to a complete shift in the war. And it went from being just U.S. political strategy in the Middle East, many different individualized acts, to launching the War on Terror. And it was launched by George W. Bush. And the War on Terror, it transformed the entire nature of the conflict. And so quickly, it's important to talk about, when talking about the conflicts, the surface tensions between these two regions, the American opinion towards Arabs. And there is a poll. I have a visual. It's not here, but so I have a visual, and it shows that Arabs had a really low favorability, almost identically reflects the polls of Arabs taken in America. And so yeah, it shows the lowest favorability rating out of any country is those main countries in the Middle East: Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Afghanistan. They got, and also the culture group Arabs and Muslims was also polled, and those also got very, very low favorability ratings. But what's in my opinion most important about this poll is that you can clearly see from the fact that there was a category for Romney voters and a category for Obama voters. So although there will be some variance in the numbers, it's generally going to be Democrat and Republican. And in the poll, it clearly reflects that there is a change in there's a bipartisan divide in opinion. And that doesn't occur with any other countries. Usually with most countries, France, with countries in Europe, with countries in Asia, the two opinions of the different groups pretty much reflect each other. There might be a change in 5% difference, or under 5% there might be a fluctuation. However, with the Americans' views on Arabs and Muslims and most countries in the Middle East, the bipartisan divide in opinion is completely unique, as it's almost opposite each other. It's shown that Democrats, even though they're both under 50%, and most Americans have an unfavorable view, Democrats are closer to the 50% mark, whereas Republicans are closer to the 0% mark. And there's at least a 25% fluctuation in favorability ratings between these two groups. So that's very, very significant, because it proves, and this poll was taken in 2014, so it proves that post 9/11, post huge conflict with Middle East countries, with Arabs and with Muslims, there is a political So anyway, the results of this poll serve as probable evidence to support the claim that the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks had a profound effect on Americans, one that shocked them into support when it came to Bush's retaliation efforts in the Middle East. And the bipartisan divide in opinion of the poll shows that there's political reasons for this. It's not just a general feeling. It's as a result of political action between the two countries. So the years following September 11, 2001 marked an obvious change in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. So wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were both part of the War on Terror, and they were long, costly, and bloody. And they involved fundamentalist differences between Shia and Sunni, and the Taliban. There were definite fundamentally different ideologies between the two wars. Whereas before, they were for strategic political action. Here, it was the War on Terror, so it was different. So Anyway, so I'm going to restate my thesis, which was that the widespread conflicts that existed between the U.S. and some parts of the Middle East have transitioned from being rooted in political necessity to being fueled by ideological differences and social distrust as a result of past political action. So to kind of tear this one apart a little bit and show how it's been proved in this presentation. So firstly, it can be seen that when the U.S. began its widespread influence in the Middle East, it was mostly to settle conflicts and disputes between former Middle Eastern governments, as well as for political necessity. We saw this with the Israeli-Palestine conflict, with the Suez Canal crisis, with the overthrow, or with the coup d'etat, 1954. These were all strategic political moves. They did not much alter American opinion towards the Middle East, and they were mostly between formal governments. It wasn't a people's war. It didn't involve sending troops out. It was just political action. And so secondly, it is clear that as U.S. intervention in the Middle East continued to grow and we had more influence in the region, members of the Arab world had compiled a serious list of complaints that, when left unresolved, became fuel for the terrorist regime. And this was seen in the many terrorist actions that occurred between the middle of the 1980s up to 2000, the latter half of the 20th century, as U.S. intervention began to reach an all-time high. And lastly, the terrorist attacks on U.S. soil brought on by U.S. intervention in the Middle East marked an extreme change in U.S. foreign policy. It changed the war completely. We then launched the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, we began a large series of wars and deployments. We lost millions of soldiers and wounded, and it changed the conflict between the two nations forever. And so, to kind of to visit my opening point, it's important to realize that in these with this conflict, unlike most countries where social tensions as part of a war are normal and they go away after a while, these social tensions between these two countries actually fueled the war in the form of terrorism and response to terrorism by the U.S. So I encourage those of you who are listening, even though this has been a very brief sum up, to look more into this issue for yourself and kind of decide for yourself what the real price of the U.S. intervention in the Middle East was and if it was worth it. Thank you.